Hello, we're Group 6. We're going to present the paper called The Relation Between Language, Culture, and Thought, written by Imai, Kaneru, and Masura in 2016. It is important, before we continue, to clarify the definitions of the authors that use on culture and language. They have two different perspectives, one for cognitive psychology and the other one for cultural psychology. Since these two terms are used in the development of the paper, it's really important to first clarify them, the definition that they are going to use in the whole paper. In the case of the researchers that investigate the Wolfram hypothesis in the perspective of cognitive psychology, the term culture is used as a collation of knowledge which only humans have attained through history, to discuss the nature of human cognition as opposed to cognition in non-human species. On the other hand, the term language, with the same perspective, is focused in particular segments of language such as perception, categorization, and knowledge representation. On the other hand, in the perspective of cultural psychology, it uses the term culture to refer to narrative, meaning systems, system of thought, cultural worldview and epistemology, communication styles, and self-construals. The term language in cultural psychology compared to cognitive psychology is to be an inseparable collection of elements consisting of words, grammar, pragmatics, and narrative styles. All these together functioning as a medium through which cultural views and cultural specific epistemologies are. And the other term that we need to clarify is the Wolfram hypothesis, because in the case of cognitive psychology, they use this hypothesis to base their research. So the Wolfram hypothesis suggests that human thought is influenced by the language one speaks. For example, words like fireman, policeman, and male nurse are examples of how language influences the way in which our society views men and women. Because if you notice it, fireman, policeman, and male nurse, the male is like how the language influences the way in which our society views men and women. Finally, we want to show you like the 3 steps that the paper has, the 3 objectives. The first one is to capture how cognitive psychology and cultural psychology have defined language and culture, and how the issues has been addressed with each research discipline. The second one is to review recent research conducted in an interdisciplinary perspective, which in reality compare the roles of culture and language. This part is more like showing how the results of the research really show how the language is affected, the thought is affected by language and culture. For example, the difference between how European thinks versus Chinese people. And finally, to highlight the importance of considering the complex interplay between culture and language to provide a comprehensive picture of how a language and culture affect the thought.
My name is Maria Lucia Molina Emiliani, and today I'm going to talk about trends in cognitive psychology. In this case, the researchers have long disagreed whether cross-linguistic diversity in linguistic codification is directly reflected in speakers' thought outside the realm of language use. The traditional debate focus on whether perception and cognition are determined by language to the degree that speakers of different languages have incommensurable varied conceptual representation and cognitive styles. The evidence accumulated over the past decades has led researchers to reject this strong version of the Whorfian hypothesis. The hypothesis suggests that human thought is influenced by the language one speaks. On the other hand, Malta and colleagues demonstrate that cross-linguistic similarity is much more pronounced in non-linguistic sorting than in naming, and emphasize that non-linguistic representation are more readily shared across different language communities than linguistic representation. The Whorfian effect disappears when implicit linguistic labeling is inhibited, or in purely non-linguistic contexts. Thus, it may not be feasible to argue that influence of thought has been established in purely non-linguistic processes. These studies led some researchers to argue that language is highly integrated into domain general cognitive functions and automatically modulates online cognitive processes. Taking the domain of color as an example, researchers have argued that language does not make us inherently sensitive or insensitive to color boundaries, but rather modifies our color processing on the spot as visual input is received. Categorical perception of color is eliminated when the use of language is inhibited by verbal interference, suggesting that language is used when we naturally perceive colors. Research using neurophysiological measures has also demonstrated that even when participants are engaging in a purely non-linguistic color discrimination task, the language region of the brain are still automatically activated to access lexical categories. Developmental researchers have shown that language makes concepts bootstrap one another, and that acquisition of language may make children more or less sensitive to particular conceptual distinctions. Also, demonstrate that language may shift the ways in which preverbal infants process motion events, showing that two groups diverge, and only Japanese fewer infants maintain sensitivity to the different types of grounds. So, this showed that these children have a disadvantage in memorizing or understanding spatial location and exact number representations. This suggests that the grammatical gender information of Spanish is automatically recruited in the bilinguals when processing English. The role of language in this broad sense does not have to be connected to the Whorfian hypothesis. It should be included in the discussion of the relation between thought and language. Finally, most researchers do not consider the diversity of culture-specific values and epistemologies in their investigation of the ways children acquire knowledge from culture.
Hello, my name is Gabriela, and I will be talking about trends in cultural psychology. Basically, this trend believes that language is a way to show certain cultural patterns. And for example, it was found that when you present a person with an emotionally charged word, that are those that tend to stir up our emotion, it can influence this person's impression over someone or something. Researchers consider unique discourses a higher level of linguistic phenomena that is acquired by interacting with other members of a given culture, which in case language reflects the values we have been culturally imposed. An example would be how Asian cultures have a high value for background information, which is notorious in their discourse, while American cultures have a higher value for analytical thinking, so background information is kind of pushed aside in daily discourse. Recently, cultural psychologists have begun to notice the influence of culture on cognitive processes. And evidence from behavioral studies show that there are cultural differences in the following aspects. The first one is attention. In this case, Japanese and American participants were shown a 20-second animated vignettes of underwater scenes and were asked to report what they saw. American participants often began their report by mentioning salient objects, which are the larger, brighter, and more colorful object in the image, while Japanese participants began by mentioning information about the background and made an overall of 65% more field observations than Americans. The second aspect is categorization, where Chinese and American children were shown triplets of objects like the ones shown on the presentation and were asked to indicate the two that went together. American children said the cow and the chicken went together because they were both animals, whereas Chinese children said the cow and the grass went together because cows eat grass. This proves that East Asians classify objects and events based on relationships, and Americans tend to do so in the basis of category membership. The third aspect is causal attribution, where Chinese and American participants were shown cartoon displays of individual fish moving in relation to a group of fish. Chinese participants were more likely to consider the behavior of the individual fish as produced by external factors, like the other fish, whereas American participants were more inclined to see the behavior of the fish as being produced by internal factors. This shows that Americans tend to describe events by referencing properties of the object, while East Asians tend to do so by referencing the interaction between object and field. Actually, advances in neuroscience have shown cross-cultural differences in brain structure and the pattern of neural activations shown in a functional MRI. The particular results in the cultural differences reflected in attention mentioned earlier suggest that being constantly exposed to a certain discourse that presents cultural values does in fact shape thought. This also proves that culture-specific behavioral patterns may be enhanced with culture-specific dialogue, and this has as a final product the formation of culture-specific attention, perception, and mode of thinking.
Hello, my name is Catalina Holguín, and I'm going to present the interaction between culture and language. This topic has inspired cognitive and cultural psychologists to inquire in the following topics: how culture-specific epistemology affects knowledge, representation, memory organization, ecological reasoning, and high-level semantic processing. An example of this kind of research is the study by Medin and company. They found that the theory for early conceptual development by Susan Carey, which states that young children begin with human-centered psychology-based understanding of biology, is only seen in technology-oriented urban cultures where human existence is perceived as independent from the living environment. They found that this theory was not true for those living in rural areas, such as the indigenous communities in North America, where humans are seen as part of the ecological system in nature. Other groups of researchers examine the mutual relationship of culture and language on the conceptual relations people use in organizing object concepts. They worked specifically with Mandarin English bilinguals, and they wanted to know whether the language being used during the research session, which was always English or Mandarin, changed the participants' preference of conceptual relation used in categorizing objects, which could be taxonomic or thematic. The results indicated that The participants switched their preferred mode of conceptual relations according to the language used in the particular experiment session. This indicates that culturally preferred mode interacts with the language used for the task. Additionally, the same group of researchers tested German, Chinese, and Japanese speakers on a range of tasks, which included categorization, similarity judgments, inductive reasoning, and they found some similarities between these groups of people. First, all of them preferred thematic over taxonomic relations in forced choice categorization, and they also relied on taxonomic rather than thematic relations in similarity judgments and inductive reasoning. On the other hand, they also found that there was a larger thematic preference from the Japanese and Chinese speakers in comparison to the German speakers. This could mean that their cognitive style could be culturally influenced because of the attention that East Asians pay to the relationship between objects, which is usually stronger than in the West. Finally, they carried out an experiment in which they presented novel words to young German, Japanese, and Chinese children. They found that Chinese children paid more attention to the object than their English reared or Japanese reared peers. Additionally, they also mapped the new word to the object, even though the argument structure of the sentence stated that the word was a verb. Taking all of this into account, it is known that there might exist a strong bias in children to map any word, be it a noun or a verb, to an object. But in this particular case, the bias is magnified by the properties of the Chinese language, which states that nouns and verbs cannot be distinguished by their morphological form. So, in conclusion, this suggests that the influence of the language sometimes works on its own and takes precedence over culture-specific cognitive biases.
My name is Enrique Vergara, and I am here to talk about the conclusion of the paper previously mentioned by my colleagues. I am here specifically to present their final topic, which elaborates on the concluding remarks and directions for future research. To the scientific community, this final topic offers a slight detour with the hope that it will facilitate further studies and inspire new hypotheses. The takeaway from the research is based on the fact that neither the premises of cultural psychology or cognitive psychology determine thought in an absolute matter. With the upbringing of research and new evidence provided from either schools of discipline, common ground in methodological and theoretical assumptions has been recognized. This suggests that the schools of thought will merge at some point, meaning that it is pointless for them to keep debating and work collaboratively. Also, the authors provide validated evidence from both positions, demonstrating that a biased approach is in fact incorrect. The second part of their final topic consists on further research on determining the effects of language and culture on our cognitive inclination. These are the recommendations the author gives for future investigators on this topic. I have narrowed it down to 4 points. Number 1, study language and culture together, as they both affect the human mind. As I said before, the authors provide sufficient evidence to study language and culture simultaneously. Number 2, study the relationship of language and culture. If the product is considered to be the criteria of the mind, or in other words, thought, investigators should also invest in determining the relationship between the two common factors. This will relieve the investigators from understanding thought and provide a new perspective on the study. Number 3. Study why specific psychological processes prevail despite changes in language and culture. This could reveal new factors that affect our thoughts and also expand our understanding of the mind. The fourth and final point of the authors is to bring in cultural evolution into the conversation, to provide a perspective about the dynamic relationship of language and culture. Cultural evolution could bring us insight about the priorities society has to determine thought. I would like to thank my fellow classmates and Professor Gordon for your time. I hope everyone has a nice day.